Welcome back. In the previous steps, we created counters and each of these counters have individual state. That's cool. But what we wanted to do is actually create something which has one counter and multiple buttons. How do we really do that? Think about it. Right now, this state is associated with each counter. Can we continue to associate state with each counter and have a single count? Where should be the single count be present? Yep, you are right. I have to move this state up. Right now, we are storing the state with each of the counters, with each of the counter buttons. However, what we would need to do is we would need to move the state a little up. One of the things I would want to do is this counter class that we created right now represents actually a counter button. It does not really represent the counter because we would want to have a single counter and a number of increment buttons. So I'll call this a counter button, and I'm saying class counter button extends component, and what we are including until now is counter buttons. So I'm actually changing everything out to counter button. Cool. It says counter button is not defined. Why? Because I need to import counter button. And counter.jsx, counter is not defined. Cool. Let's fix that as well. Cool. So now you would have everything working. So we have the counter button and we have state associated with the counter. But what we would want to do is actually create a component representing all the component buttons, right? That's where we would want to start creating a new component called counter, which contains all the counter buttons. So rather than have the app create the counter buttons, I would want to have the counter create the counter buttons right now. So let's actually copy the render method from here. So copy and paste the render method in here. Oops. And over here, the class name is equal to, let's say, counter, and return this counter buttons. So the counter buttons are directly defined in here, so I don't really need to do an import. And over here, instead of actually using the counter button, let's use the counter. So the app only includes a counter. It does not worry about each of the counter buttons. Cool. Let's save this. We'll have errors. Counter is not defined. app.js. I would want to import counter from counter component. Will it work? Nope, not yet. Oops, it's working. But it's only showing one counter because what is happening is what is exported by default? Exported by default is counter button. This counter button is being used as counter, and that is what is being shown. What we want to do is we would want to export counter. So let's do that. Export default counter. Now you have three buttons which are present in here, and everything is working as it is. So what we have done until now is we have done simple refactoring, right? So we wanted to actually create a counter button class and include a number of counter buttons inside the counter. What we have is, as we started thinking about our problem, we started to understand the fact that this button actually represents just a counter button. It's not really the counter itself. The counter itself will need to have single count and multiple buttons, and that's why we created a counter button class and we created a counter class containing the multiple counter buttons. One of the things that you can do as an exercise is actually refactor the counter button out into a class of its own, so into a module of its own. But for now, I'll leave it as it is, and in the next steps, let's start actually moving the state from the counter button to the counter. Let's see what are the challenges we would face while doing that. I hope you are having an interesting time doing this. The idea behind the entire course was to make it a very interesting experience, and that's why we designed this counter example, so that we actually move a lot of stuff from a number of places to other so that you have a deep understanding of what's happening behind the screens, as well as you have a deep understanding of how to design stuff with React. I'm sure you're having a wonderful experience, and I'll see you in the next step.